Hello and welcome back to Tree of Statism. Today we want to talk about propaganda. Propaganda is a type of information or piece of literature that is intended to convince you of something, of an idea or of legitimacy or of some kind of ideal. It is created in a way that is one-sided and meant to give you a certain opinion, to create a certain belief inside of you that is the correct belief. It will never show the opposition point of views. That means that there might be a counterpoint, but you don't want people to know what the counterpoint is. It will also be given in a format that you can't argue. That is to say, you can't argue with the book or the writer because you're not talking to him, you're reading from a piece of paper. You can't argue with the news or with the newspaper. You can't argue with a movie. And you can't argue if the comment section is closed. It is intended always to create an emotional response. The idea is that instead of using facts and logic, your feelings will not care about facts. The point is that once you think emotionally, you're not going to be thinking rationally, and you're going to be offended by any opposing viewpoint. A great example that is often used is comparing ideas or parties or people to the Nazi Party. They were obviously the bad guys because of the Holocaust, but not everything they did was as bad as the Holocaust. There are minor evils or even things that they were right about. However, because of the Holocaust, they are still the bad guys. The comparison to the Nazis is supposed to invoke the Holocaust. It's supposed to make the other person look bad, regardless of what they are doing. And it doesn't matter how relevant that actual action is to the Holocaust. The state often wants to propagandize the population. For this reason, it wishes to own the media. That is, to make sure that newscasters and journalists can't say the wrong thing. They can be fired or executed or punished in any other way if they step out of the propaganda. This turns most media outlets into propaganda pieces. However, we also see a similar problem with privately owned media. The reason is that they're very dependent on donors or on specific owners. They may have to take orders from the owners so that they can't talk freely about anything the owner does. That is to say, if I own your newscast station, your media station, you can't talk about my illegal activities, my court cases, whatever is going to happen. Also, the donors that don't own can always defund your news outlet by stopping their donations. So, if you want to run a hit piece against them, if you want to run anything negative about them, they will turn to your editor, and your editor will have to decide, do we give up half the funding? Do we give up a third of the funding, a tenth of the funding? Do we give up a large part of the funding, or do we give up this specific story? The answer is usually we have to give up this specific story so that we can do most of the other stories anyway. Reading propaganda is not advised. Often, people who are dumb or rather less educated and do not understand the subject fall for it. That is to say, I might be a physicist or an economist, however, I don't understand foreign policy, so I don't understand the propaganda here. We could be talking about some other foreign nation that you don't know much about. We could be talking about a subject you don't understand. There's a lot of different subjects, and reading propaganda is not advised. However, here we have decided to take a specific piece of propaganda in order to read through it and explain why a lot of the things that it says sound good. However, with a little bit of digging deep, digging in, you can kind of understand why it is very much one-sided. The piece of propaganda we're going to take is the letter to America. This was a letter written by Osama bin Laden as a kind of propaganda piece to try to explain and justify his side after Al-Qaeda committed the 9/11 attacks, and to try to kind of explain his position. From the very get-go, Osama bin Laden starts talking in religious terms. Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden specifically were a religious group. Many ideologies exist, and they specifically tend to talk more about the Islamic nation and Islamic issues than they talk about other issues. One of the very first claims that was very, very important to mention is that he claimed his God allows the believers to engage in revenge and holy wars against non-believers and idol worshippers. This is very common in many different religions, and in many different religions, the other religions don't like it when you wage holy war against them. Not when it's the Crusades, not when it's jihad, pretty much not when it's any kind of type of religious war. One of the major issues he brings up is the occupation of Palestine. He defines it as being occupied for 80 years, from 1920 to 2001, not because in 2001 the status changed, but because he was writing in 2001. He also mentioned the Jews as occupying them for 50 years, from 1948 to 2001. He is not talking about 1967 borders, because at the time he wrote this, those lines had only existed for about 35 years. He was talking about all of Israel, and this is a distinction between some of the modern Western people who oppose the issue based on 67 lines. He then proceeds to lay claims why they have claim over it. He does not use the nativist claim. He does not say, well, Palestinians have always lived there, so therefore they belong there. He does not say they have lived there for hundreds of years, so it belongs to them. He says that Islam inherited Moses, and Islam is the true religion. And then he says that when Palestine was occupied by the Muslims, that was a good thing. And then the locals converted, and that was a good thing. Because he is talking about an Islamic point of view. He then also claims that he supports other conflicts in which the Muslims are oppressed. In Somalia, where there's a civil war. In Chechnya by the Russians, because the Russians oppressed rebel groups that are Chechnyan, but they're more Chechnyan than they are Islamic groups. In Kashmir, where it is a disputed area with Hindus and Muslims, and they kind of dispute who should own the place. And earlier when we mentioned that he said his God believes that you're allowed to wage war on the idol worshippers, well, in India for hundreds of years, the Mughal Empire oppressed Hindus. Hindus are the idol worshippers in this case. Lebanon and Israel was also mentioned. At the time, it was no longer an ongoing conflict because it had ended about 1.5 years earlier, in the middle of 2000. However, it was an ongoing long conflict that they did not like very much. A recurring theme is that he opposes the fact that, or rather Al-Qaeda opposes the fact that they won't let them turn to Sharia law. That is to say, the radical group does want for the Islamic states to turn to Islamic theocracy. Without talking specifically about theocracy, we have seen other theocracies like Christian theocracies, and generally this should be a red flag for anyone who reads it because it's usually a bad system. He then also argues that the Arab states arrest opposition. However, the point he kind of makes from time to time again is that the problem is not arresting the bad people, but rather the bad people arresting religious people who try to make their countries a theocracy. They also criticize the states, that the Muslim states, for selling resources cheaply for military aid, because that's how vassal relationships kind of work. I had a video, check out my video on the empires and vassal states. And of course, they call this they blame them for causing the Arab states to have peace treaties with Israel, which they just call the Jews. They kind of don't say Israelis or Israel often, they just say the Jews, the Jews, the Jews every time in the letter. There is no kind of distinction between Israeli Jews and foreign Jews. Again, anti-Semitic ideas, which is actually also mentioned because he says we are Semitic, therefore we can't be anti-Semitic, which is silly because black people can be anti-black people. That's called Uncle Tom's. You can be of a group and still say horrible things about the group. And also, when you're saying anti-Semitic, you're not talking about Arabs, you're not talking about Muslims. When you say anti-Semitic, you're talking about being anti-Jewish. It's a purposeful misunderstanding of the statement. All in all, it seems that he kind of wants to overthrow the government, install a Islamic theocracy, ethnically cleanse or kill the Jews in Israel specifically, and he sees any government that stops him from doing this as the bad guys. He also blames the foreign powers on internal strife and the sale of oil at low prices on the West. And both these last 2 points are kind of true. However, it should be mentioned that internal strife starts from the inside. It is only when tribes are willing to kill each other that foreign powers can give them guns and demand oil in exchange. If they do not hate each other, the empires can throw guns and there will still not be any civil war. Civil wars in the Middle East have existed for a few centuries at least. We have a lot of we have a lot of records about different tribes killing other tribes, even under the Ottoman Empire. He also mentions foreign military bases in the Middle East, saying they are there to protect the Jews and to protect illegitimate governments. However, it should be mentioned, you may not remember what happened 30 or 40 years ago, but the 80s had an 8-year-long conflict between Iran and Iraq, where Iraq invaded Iran. And in 1991, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait to liberate their oil. And America led an Arab coalition to kick him out. That is to say that before you start talking about American bases all over the Middle East, protecting Arab states, protecting Israel from Arab states, they are there mostly to protect Arab states from other Arab states because they kind of step over each other for the oil. An interesting argument he does bring up is 150,000 children that were starved by sanctions on Iraq. The context is that Iraq committed multiple war crimes against the Kurds and the Iranians, and the UN tried to solve that with sanctions to kind of make Iraq change its path. That didn't work. Saddam Hussein remained in power, and instead of harming the government, it harmed the lower classes, the poor people. The people who barely had enough money as it is suddenly found the country under sanctions, and some of them began to starve. Since then, there is a large question about sanctions. Are sanctions humane? Because in a lot of cases, they harm the population more than they harm the actual leadership. This being said, there was a good reason for Iraq being sanctioned, including the use of chemical weapons on Kurds and on Iranians and other such war crimes. Also, he mentions a false accusation that Israel plans to destroy Al-Aqsa. 20 years later, it still stands. Nobody is trying to demolish it. The reasons he says that his attack on civilians are legitimate, and I do not agree with these reasons. However, he says that because you vote and because you pay taxes, the government serves what the Americans decide to do. He's a great comedian, and anyone who's been following American politics knows that politicians don't do what the voters want, and tax dollars are taken by force. If you refuse to pay taxes, you're going to jail. Your tax dollars are also fund foreign armies that he doesn't like the governments that oppress the peaceful religious extremists that want Islamic theocracies and Israel. And he also invokes the fact that his religion permits revenge. The problem with the revenge is that an eye for an eye and the whole world goes blind. Nobody agrees that the other party took revenge legitimately. So everyone takes revenge for what the other side did. Just another round of revenge all around. More and more revenge usually until either one side wins or until they kind of decide to compromise and have peace. His letter then shifts to what he wants you to do. And this is full of a bunch of red flags. The first one is convert to his religion. Now, many Muslims will tell you that jihad means struggle and there's more meanings than the religious wars. In this case, he's saying, no, I am fighting you so that you will convert to Islam. This should be a major red flag. He wanted you to convert or die. His next few steps are kind of the tenets of Islam. He mentions them in general expressions. However, reading a bit, digging a bit deeper kind of is supposed to shock you. Fornication, drinking, homosexuality, and gambling. None of these things are seen as kind of holy. However, most of you don't see drinking as that bad. Most of you have probably some point in the last week drank something. Fornication is kind of an abstract concept. It is bad activities. However, there's different religions that permit different things. Homosexuality, it should be mentioned, this is not part of the modern debate about trans women in women's bathrooms, or even gay marriage. We're talking about 2001, before Barack Obama changed his opinion, before a bunch of people changed their opinion. We're talking about homosexuality, not about gay marriage. There are many Muslim countries where there is the death penalty for homosexuality or prison sentences. That seems to be what he wants as a religious fundamentalist. He also says that America is the worst civilization. While the inner troll in me wants to say he was right about that one, you have to remember he is not writing from some kind of advanced Western country. He's not writing from Korea or Japan or China, not even South America, which is kind of here, kind of there. He's talking from the caves of Afghanistan, a country that is very, very tribal, a country that has polygamy that is not accepted in most of the West, a country that has a lot of Sharia kind of laws that are very, very Islamic and a bit backwards. Some states have laws about cutting off hands and killing gays, throwing them off rooftops. That is the advanced civilization that he is talking about you being bad in compared to. While many of you may agree with a bunch of different ideas on how to improve America, let's be honest, no one is saying America is perfect and everyone has ideas how to improve it. That being said, there are civilizations that are on par or doing even better than America, and then there's Afghanistan. Afghanistan under the Taliban. not exactly the best case of a better civilization. The next major red flag that he has is his opposition of church and state, because America has specific laws in the Constitution to separate church and state. Now, this should be, first of all, a huge major red flag, religious extremism and religious fundamentalism. This being said, separation of church and state should be understood not as a separation of religion and state. You are allowed to be as religious as you want to be. However, after many, many, many religious wars and arguments and debates, the Christians decided that the difference between Protestantism and Catholics and Quakers and Mormons are all minor, and instead of fighting other Christians, we should live and let live. Even Jews are not that bad. This idea was built in a mostly Christian country with mostly Christian sects, with the idea that let's not have multi-generational religious wars over the small details. Something we do not see in the Islamic world, where Sunnis and Shiites and other tiny sects fight each other over these concepts. And in this case, we have a religious fundamentalist who doesn't exactly get it. He thinks that the separation of church and state is supposed to be that everyone is secular, instead of understanding that instead of Sunnis and Shiites killing each other, maybe they should not be fighting over the tiny details about who should have inherited Muhammad 1400 years ago. He also mentions several other red flags. He opposes usury, that is, loaning with interest, and blames the Jews for usury and for taking over the media, which would, like, I'm surprised he's not a white supremacist, because this sounds just like what white supremacists usually say about the Jews. You could argue against both issues on their own merit. However, immediately invoking the Jews is usually considered an anti-Semitic trope. This should be a major red flag. He's against intoxication. He's against gambling. He doesn't like the sex trade, although there's quite a bit to talk about that issue. He does specifically mention incest, which is bad, first of all. However, this comes from a region where they regularly marry cousins or second cousins and third cousins, and it's a bit kind of hypocritical that, like, oh no, marrying cousins is perfectly fine. We're only against the incest, the direct incest. That's the red line. Another great example that there is inside the letter is that the Clintons were immoral in the White House. And he, I think, is referring specifically to Monica Lewinsky. Now, for a lot of you in 2023, you don't remember what happened in the 90s. However, there was a major scandal because Bill Clinton had consensual relations with one of his interns in the White House. She was not forced in any kind of way, and he lied about it to Congress. Now, this was a big thing in the 90s, and some people would still argue that because she was one of his interns, they still call it like statutory rape, like, oh my God, what if she couldn't say no? It doesn't seem to be one of those situations, and it was just a big deal in the 90s. I think a lot of people in 2023 would not have had as much of a problem with it if it was today. Then he mentions it like some kind of major scandal, and quite frankly, most of you don't remember it because it was a bit over the top at the time. One specific issue that you need to deep dive into to understand is that he opposes the sex trade and that everything is sexualized. This would seem very, very correct and appealing to modern feminists because we do see that a lot of modern companies try to sell things by putting women in bikinis next to everything. They want to sell cars, so they bring a woman in a bikini to stand next to it because some men are dumb and they will just see an almost naked woman and buy things. And also there's the direct sex trade, that is to say pornography and whores. However, the alternative he's offering is not exactly a woman's paradise. In the advanced Muslim countries, women are birthing factories. They are hidden inside lots of clothes, usually at home, can't say no to the husband, don't have working rights, they can't work if the husband says no, they take multiple wives. This is not exactly a woman's paradise. So when he says that he opposes these things, well, yes, but he doesn't exactly oppose them from the feminist point of view. Another issue that you need to dive into to understand is, or rather, read it consistently and understand the issue. He says that America or the West is to blame for pollution, and he blames America for not signing the Kyoto Accords. Um, this is coming from a country that thinks it's not against carbon fuel, against fossilized fuels. On the contrary, he just wants Muslim states to profit from the oil and the gas and the coal, and he just doesn't want it to be extracted from their countries. This is more of a point that is inconsistent with the rest of what he's talking about. He also talks about corruption in the American government. He talks about money in politics. And he blames the Jews. Yet again, another red flag. One of the things he opposes is the fact that America has killed more than any other nation ever. The reason is that wars are getting bigger and worse, and more people are dying, and now America is the biggest empire. The issue is not something new. Back when Napoleon was leading France, and France was a big empire, a lot of people died then, more than at any point before in history. Up until then, World War II was a lot worse than the Napoleonic Wars. It's entirely possible that anything in World War II will be trumped, or anything in World War II will seem kind of small to the potential of World War III. He also opposes the fact that America installs democracies and turns against them when it is no longer convenient. This is a problem. This is a real problem with empires and vassal states, where the empire is not really interested in democracy. It is interested in uh, gas and oil, but also a lot of Arab states have removed their own democracies. One such case is, for example, Algeria, where the army couped the legal elections. And that's kind of a problem of, do you force democracy on those states? Since then, we've seen many examples in the Arab Spring, but we're talking about a letter from 2001. He mentions a double standard for war crimes and a double standard for weapons of mass destruction. However, it should be noticed that war crimes are, first of all, kind of put in a blanket statement, where there are the hardline war crimes, and then there are things that are technically war crimes. For example, hardline war crimes is the mass execution of civilians, versus there are minor war crimes like bombing something that's been used both as a legitimate military objective, and also a uh, civilian use. One such example that is unrelated to the letter is, for example, a case I know that during the 70s it was noticed that one such location in Egypt had a bunch of command vehicles around some structure in the desert. And when there's a bunch of command vehicles, that means that there's usually a command post inside. And the place was bombed, and the place was a command center, but there was also a school for some local Bedouin children. So they died as well. And that's a war crime, because it's a war crime to have those two types of structures together. It's a war crime to bomb such a structure because you're also harming the children. It was also problematic and a big deal at the time, but it's not exactly the killing systematically of opposing tribes or of enemy nations. Also, he mentions a very, very important double standard about the creation of weapons of mass destruction. Because at the time, Israel supposedly had nukes and may still have them. There's no official documentation on this from Israel, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have them. And Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He had mostly gas weapons. Gas weapons that he used against the Kurds in Iraq, his own people. And he used against Iranians in the Iran-Iraq war. The major difference about standards comes from the fact that Israel may or may not have nukes, and in 30 or by now 50 years that they have nukes, they have not once used it, versus a leader that has used it twice against a foreign nation and against his own people. Why the double standard? Because it matters who holds the gun. Saddam Hussein used the weapons of mass destruction in the 80s and 90s. His final demands are quite simple. He wants you to leave their lands, that is to say, Islamic lands. India has to give up Kashmir, Israel has to be dismantled, Russia has to leave Chechnya, the Philippines have to leave the South Philippine Islands. Anywhere that there's enough Muslims is Muslim land, as far as he is concerned. What he's calling for is self-deportations or ethnic cleansing in these areas, something that if you would apply this standard to a Muslim nation, he would be against this. He did actually mention Palestine in the early parts of the letter, which is important to say that he is very much against the same things being done to them as what he requests be done to others. He sees it from his point of view and does not see it as, we want this and they want this, and he does not mention that those people also have rights, and he's not talking about our lands in the sense of private property, but in the sense of national property, and he wants certain nations to be removed or to retreat and leave areas. He does not want you to support their corrupt leaders. Their corrupt leaders are the people, as mentioned before, not allowing him to create theocratic states. They want more secular ideas. He does not want you to intervene in their education, which usually means women's rights and gay rights, and Western concepts like that. And he wants you to treat them like equals, something that empires usually don't do. If you have not been following so far, the major point of the criticism is that he wants a lot of things to be done to non-Muslims that he would not accept being done to Muslims. He advocates for a lot of things that you would not accept today. A lot of the people who claim that they have read the letter probably didn't read the letter. There are a lot of progressive leftists that should have disagreed with the letter the moment he started talking about the Jews in America or the gays. And there are a bunch of red flags about theocracy here. That is to say that most of you probably don't want a Catholic theocracy. Most of you probably don't want a Protestant theocracy. Most of you don't want a Jewish theocracy or a Hindu theocracy or a Buddhist theocracy. I'm not even sure how that one would work. Most of you don't want theocracy of any religion, and there are a lot of Muslims that wouldn't want a Muslim theocracy. And this is not exactly this letter has so many red flags that anyone that read it and understands should have seen immediately. Also, there's a lot of points that if you have a bit of historical context, it explains itself. For example, why do we have a double standard between a country that used weapons of mass destruction versus the country that didn't use weapons of mass destruction? There's a bunch of details that if you understand the historical context, you'd be against it, not because of 9/11, but because of the ideas he's pushing. Now, this is how propaganda is supposed to work. You're not supposed to know how to argue with it. You're not supposed to be allowed to ask Bin Laden questions directly, because asking questions kind of makes it seem bad. The point is for him to make his points and you to accept them. You, the dumb person, or you, the uneducated person, that does not know about these issues specifically, that does not know history specifically, that does not understand what we're talking about. And he's supposed to throw a bunch of slogans out there, a bunch of statements that it's like, oh, okay, I see what you're saying, or rather, you misunderstand what he's saying, but you're supposed to agree with him without arguing with him. This is one of many propaganda pieces. Reading propaganda is not advised. If you like this video, please comment, upvote, and subscribe. If you want to help further, go and watch my other videos. And if you like them as well, do the same over there. Also, please share this video and any other video you might think people might take interest in. If you want to support me further, you can buy my book on Amazon, Ancapistan by Noah Goodman. Thank you for watching, and good night.